The winter of 1944 bit down hard on the Ardennes, and the trees stood like frozen soldiers under a sky choked with grey. The kind of grey that swallows sound and steals hope. The wind wasn't just cold. It was cruel, slicing through uniforms and into bone, pushing snowflakes sideways like they were running from something terrible. Each gust carried the smell of pine and ice and something else, something metallic, like the air itself knew what was coming. Inside a frozen M10 Wolverine tank destroyer, hidden beneath a camouflage net that crackled with ice. Private First Class. Ray Thompson pressed his face against the periscope, his breath fogging the glass in shallow bursts, his gloved fingers shaking, not from fear exactly, but from a cold so deep it felt like the metal itself was trying to pull the warmth straight out of his blood. He'd been in this position for hours, maybe days. Time had a way of blurring when you were this cold, this tired, this aware that death could come from any direction. 800 yards downrange, maybe less, a German armored column moved through the forest like a steel snake hunting prey. 12 vehicles, maybe more, Panzer IVs mostly, their engines growling low and mean, exhaust mixing with the fog like dragon's breath. And at the front, leading them all like some kind of iron god, a tiger Yi, its long barrel sweeping the trees like it was searching for something to kill. Behind them came half-tracks, loaded with infantry, soldiers bundled in grey coats, their rifles pointed outward like the spines of a porcupine, fuel trucks bringing up the rear, ammunition carriers, field kitchens, even a self-propelled anti-aircraft gun, watching the sky for American planes that weren't coming. They were headed straight for a crossroads that meant everything. A road that, if lost, would cut off the 101st Airborne Division, trapped in Bastogne, strangle their supply lines, and leave thousands of Americans to freeze or die in the snow. Surrounded, outnumbered, forgotten, Thompson had no orders, no green light, no permission to fire. He'd been told to wait, to watch, to report, to stay hidden, and let someone else make the call. But he could see what was about to happen. He could see the future in the angle of their approach, in the tightness of their formation, in the way they moved, like they owned the forest, like they'd already won. And in that moment, Ray Thompson made a choice that would rewrite the rules of war, without a single command from above, without clearance, without backup. He reached for the firing mechanism and everything changed. The air, the war, the meaning of duty itself. Just 3 days earlier, the air inside a drafty Belgian farmhouse had smelled like damp wood and old smoke. Ray Thompson sat hunched over a cold metal desk, while his commanding officer briefed the crew of the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion. The officer's voice was flat, emotionless, like he was reading from a script he'd memorized years ago. "No one fires without confirmation from command," he said, his eyes scanning the room, making sure every man understood. "I don't care what you see. I don't care how close they get. We do not give away our position unless ordered. Is that understood?" The men nodded, Thompson included, but there was a tension in the room that no one spoke about, a feeling that orders and reality were about to collide in the worst possible way. You could see it in their eyes. The doubt, the frustration, the knowledge that sometimes by the time orders came, it was already too late. Outside, the Battle of the Bulge was just beginning. On December 16th, under a blanket of fog and falling snow, the German army had launched its final massive offensive on the Western Front. They called it Operation Watch on the Rhine. The goal was brutal and simple. Split the Allied line in half, capture the port of Antwerp, force a negotiated peace before the Allies could push into Germany. They came with over 200,000 men, more than 1,000 tanks, and the element of total surprise. American lines buckled like cardboard. Some units disappeared overnight. Radio silence turned into permanent silence. Friendly positions changed by the hour. Confusion spread faster than the cold. And in that chaos, commanders feared something almost worse than the enemy. Friendly fire. The nightmare of American tanks firing on American soldiers because no one knew where anyone was anymore. because the fog was so thick and the lines so scrambled that identifying friend from foe became almost impossible. So the rule was ironclad. Wait for orders, for Thompson. That meant observation duty, nothing more. He and his three-man crew were dug into a ridge near a forest road, north of Neuville, a small crossroads town just outside Bastogne. They had good cover, solid elevation, a clear view of the valley below, and absolutely no permission to engage day after day. Thompson scanned the terrain through his frosted scope. He marked tank tracks in the snow, counted tree trunks stripped bare by German treads, sketched enemy movements in a small notebook his mother had mailed him months before. The pages were worn now, stained with coffee and dirt, filled with drawings that looked more like engineering diagrams than battlefield notes. He logged everything: range, bearing, wind speed, temperature, the angle of the sun when it broke through the clouds. But he didn't fire, not once. One afternoon, he'd tracked a lone Panzer creeping near a ravine for nearly an hour, his finger resting on the trigger, his heart pounding in his chest like it wanted to break free. No orders came, the tank passed, and the anger inside him burned hotter than the cold ever could. But the discipline held. He knew what his job was. He knew the cost of a wrong shot. One shell fired at the wrong target could mean a dozen dead Americans. Or worse, a revealed position that would bring down an entire German artillery battery in return. But as the hours dragged on and more enemy traffic moved through the trees, the question inside his head changed. Was holding fire really the safer option, or was it just the easier one? Was discipline the same thing as cowardice when men were dying while you watched? Thompson wasn't reckless. He was precise, methodical, almost obsessive. He studied German columns like a chess player studies the board. He knew how they moved, how they stacked vehicles for mutual support, how they relied on tight formations that made them efficient in open terrain, but vulnerable in confined spaces. And more importantly, he knew where to hit them, if and when the time ever came. He just didn't know yet that he would be the one to decide when that time was, that the choice would fall on his shoulders alone. Raymond. Charles Thompson wasn't born a soldier. He grew up in western Kansas, in a place so flat and empty, you could watch a storm coming from 2 hours away, where winter wind could strip paint off a barn, and summer heat baked the wheat fields until they cracked open like dried bread. His father, Charles, ran a small engine repair shop in town, fixing tractors and grain elevators, teaching his son how machines worked, how everything had a logic to it if you looked close enough. His mother, Anna, taught 7th grade math at the local school, drilling fractions and geometry into farm kids who'd rather be anywhere else. Ray grew up surrounded by gears, grease, and graph paper. He saw the world through angles and equations, through cause and effect. He could tell you exactly how far away a grain silo was just by measuring the length of its shadow. He understood leverage, velocity, trajectory, things most kids never thought about. When most kids played with slingshots, Ray was building one with a pulley system and counterweights, trying to calculate how far he could launch a pebble with pure precision. His friends thought he was weird. His teachers thought he was gifted. His parents just hoped he'd find something to do with all that thinking. He didn't join the army because he was itching for a fight. He enlisted in 1942 because he wanted to study engineering, and the army offered him training, pay, and a future. He got the training. The pay wasn't much. The future, well, that depended on surviving Europe, and survival, he was learning, depended on being smarter than the other guy. By the time Thompson arrived in Normandy, he was 22 years old and already looked 5 years older, the kind of older that comes from seeing things you can't unsee. His first combat experience came in the hedgerows of France, where the enemy could be 10 feet away, and you wouldn't know until the bullets started flying, where every field was a potential grave, and every hedge hid a German machine gun nest. He watched a friend named Jimmy Delgado burn alive when a Panzer shell caught their half-track in a roadside ditch. He could still hear Jimmy screaming, still smell the burning flesh and rubber. Another friend, Frank Murray, was vaporized by a mine outside St. Lo. 1 second he was there, the next he was just gone. A red mist and scattered pieces. Thompson stopped believing in luck after that. Stopped believing in orders that came too late. Stopped believing in safe distances. He started believing in patterns, in routines, in things he could control. He studied how tanks moved, where they paused, how long it took for a turret to rotate, how German crews positioned themselves, what their blind spots were. He started carrying a small spiral notebook in his jacket. Every German vehicle he encountered, he'd sketch it, note the vulnerabilities, the weak points in the armor, the places where a shell could penetrate. It became an obsession, a way to make sense of the chaos, a way to convince himself that war wasn't just random violence, but something that could be understood, predicted, maybe even controlled if you were smart enough. He didn't talk much. Other soldiers called him the quiet clock, because when he did speak, it was short, direct, and usually timed down to the second. He'd say things like, "Contact in 30 seconds and be right," or "That tank will stop at the crossroads," and it would. But when it came to gunnery, he was deadly. Not flashy, not fast, just accurate, predictable in the best possible way. In the Army's view, he was a good gunner, disciplined, smart, calm under fire. What they didn't realize, what even his closest crewmates didn't fully see, was that Ray Thompson was also a thinker, a tactician, not just a trigger puller, but a man who could see a battlefield, like a chessboard, who understood that war was mathematics, geometry, psychology all wrapped up in blood and steel, and in 3 days' time, that quiet Kansas farm kid with the angle-obsessed brain would rewrite the rules of engagement in a single burst of firepower. Because sometimes war doesn't reward those who follow instructions. It rewards the ones who understand when to break them. On the morning of December 19th, 1944, the fog lay thick and low across the Ardennes. It clung to the branches like smoke that wouldn't burn off. Visibility was almost zero. Sound was distorted, muffled, strange. Voices carried weirdly through the mist. Engines sounded closer than they were, but through his periscope, Ray Thompson saw them. First, the unmistakable silhouette of a Tiger-on tank, that beast with its long barrel and square, brutal shoulders. A machine that had become legendary among American tankers, a machine that could kill you from a mile away. Then another shape, and another. The German column was moving through the forest road like a steel serpent hunting its next meal. 12 vehicles. Maybe more. It was hard to count through the fog, but Thompson counted anyway. He always counted. It was a textbook armored assault column. Clean, tight, disciplined. Everything the German army was known for. Everything American commanders feared. At the front, the Tiger led like a battering ram, capable of punching through nearly anything the Americans had. Its armor so thick that most American shells just bounced off like pebbles. Behind it came 3 Panzer IV tanks, each one fast, efficient, deadly in its own right. Workhorses of the German army, reliable and mean. Then came 2 half-tracks filled with infantry, soldiers bundled against the cold. Rifles pointed outward, breath steaming in the frozen air. Behind them, support vehicles, ammunition trucks, fuel tankers, field kitchens, even a mobile workshop. The tail end of the column was flanked by a self-propelled anti-aircraft gun, a sign they were expecting contact and prepared for anything. Anything except one unapproved American gunner with a Wolverine and a gut full of conviction. Anything except Ray Thompson. The road they were on was narrow, barely wider than the column itself. Steep forest banks rose on either side. Thick trees hemmed them in like walls. No room to maneuver, no room to scatter if something went wrong. If they were attacked, they'd be trapped, packed together like sardines in a can to Thompson. It wasn't just a road. It was a kill zone, a trap waiting to be sprung. Nature had built it. The Germans had walked into it, and now he had to decide whether to spring it. But here's the problem. Ray had no orders. No one else could see what he saw. Radio contact with his battalion's forward headquarters was weak. Garbled, sometimes non-existent, the only way to reach command was to reposition the vehicle and risk exposure. By protocol, he was supposed to observe the enemy, report their heading, let air support or artillery take the lead. But Thompson wasn't watching a column in transit. He was watching a blade aimed straight at the throat of the American line. He was watching the future, and the future was bad. That road, the one they were creeping down, led directly to the Novel crossroads. If they took Novel, they'd flank the defenders at Bastogne from the north. The 101st Airborne Division, already encircled and running out of ammunition, would lose its last major supply lifeline. The result would be catastrophic. Tens of thousands of Americans cut off in the cold, surrounded, starved, finished, and yet the tanks kept moving forward, calm, confident, protected by the belief that American forces were disorganized, scared, and stretched too thin to respond. They were half right. Ray Thompson was scared. He was cold. He was isolated. But he wasn't disorganized. He was calculating, running numbers in his head, angles, distances, timing, the mathematics of death. He knew that if he fired too early, they'd scatter if he hit the wrong target. The others might escape or return fire with overwhelming force. But if he fired with precision, just the right vehicles in the right order, he could do something most officers would say was impossible. He could dismantle an entire armored column piece by piece, and he'd have to do it without a word from command, without backup, without permission. He licked his lips, reached for the elevation dial, took one last look at the formation, and waited for the moment no manual had prepared him for, the moment when duty and disobedience became the same thing. Ray Thompson had never fired without orders, not once, not in training, not in France, not even when his instincts told him to pull the trigger days earlier as a lone Panzer crossed his scope. But now, staring at a perfectly exposed German armored column crawling forward like clockwork, he realized something. Waiting was no longer caution. Waiting was suicide. Waiting meant watching good men die while he did nothing. And so, with no radio contact, no green light, and no one to back him up, Ray adjusted the angle, held his breath, and fired. But he didn't aim for the lead tank. He aimed for the third, because the lead tank was too obvious, too expected, because hitting the third would create chaos, would trap the entire column, would turn their formation into a prison. The armor-piercing round left the barrel of the M10 Wolverine with a thunderous roar that shattered the quiet and kicked a wave of snow into the air. The sound echoed through the forest like thunder. The shell traced a perfect arc through the fog. And then it struck the 3rd Panzer Favor directly in the flank. The explosion sent a shockwave through the trees. Branches snapped. Snow fell in sheets. A plume of fire and black smoke erupted into the fog. Metal screamed, twisted. The entire column halted. But Thompson wasn't done, as his loader rammed in the next shell. Hands moving on pure muscle memory. Thompson shifted position slightly, 5 yards to the left. Just enough to throw off any German gunners scanning for muzzle flash. Just enough to create the illusion of multiple guns. Then he fired again, this time at the 6th vehicle. The blast ripped through the half-track carrying infantry. Its fuel tank ignited instantly. Bodies were thrown into the trees like rag dolls. The fire spread to the dry underbrush, lighting the forest floor in patches of orange and black. Smoke billowed. Men screamed. The Germans were no longer halted. They were panicking. And panic was exactly what Thompson needed. The Tiger at the front tried to reverse. Gears grinding, engine roaring. But the column was packed too tightly. The crew inside the Tiger shouted and gestured furiously, trying to clear a path. But behind them, the rest of the formation was now bottlenecked. Blinded, burning, boxed in. Thompson reloaded again. His crew, now fully alert and realizing what was happening, didn't question him. They followed his lead. They trusted him. He fired at the 8th vehicle, a fuel truck. The result was instant and biblical. The explosion rocked the hillside, flames jetting skyward like a volcanic blast. The heat was so intense you could feel it from 800 yards away. The force knocked two nearby infantrymen to the ground. The fireball backlit the tank silhouettes like ghostly shadows. From a distance, it sounded like a full artillery ambush. In reality, it was one man, one gun, and a gut feeling that sometimes breaking the rules was the only way to save lives. But the order of his shots wasn't random. Thompson had spent months studying German doctrine. He knew their reliance on tight formations, knew the logic behind their placement, fuel and support in the rear, armor in front, infantry in the middle. By taking out the third vehicle, he created a physical block. By hitting the sixth, he jammed the middle. The eighth fuel truck crippled their retreat and ignited chaos. It was a chain reaction firing pattern, a surgical disruption of German tactical structure. Each shot was a scalpel, not a hammer. The Germans, now confused and cut off, began firing wildly into the trees. Their machine gunners riddled snowbanks and empty trunks. Infantrymen ducked behind flaming wrecks, unsure of where the fire was coming from. To them, how it felt like a trap, an orchestrated ambush by an entire battery of American tank destroyers. But there was no ambush. There was no battery. Just Ray Thompson and a crew who had stopped asking questions. Just one man who understood that war wasn't about following orders. It was about making the right decision at the right moment. As the enemy scrambled, Thompson moved again. Using the forest terrain like a sniper, he knew how to use angles, knew how far his gun could reach without revealing too much. Every new position was chosen for cover, for elevation, for maximum confusion. He wasn't just shooting, he was dismantling. And each blast was another page torn from the German field manual. He was rewriting doctrine in real time, teaching the enemy a lesson they'd never forget. The Ardennes had gone silent just moments before the first shell. Now it screamed. Trees cracked and fell under shockwaves, snow, fire, and shrapnel filled the air like confetti from a hellish celebration. Thompson's third shot had set off a fuel truck. The fourth struck a half-track that had tried to reverse. Its wheels were already spinning in the icy mud when the shell hit, sending the chassis skyward in a twisted arc of steel. The German Tiger at the front was stuck. The crew tried desperately to reverse, but they were trapped between flaming wreckage and vehicles behind that couldn't move without ramming each other. Their tight, disciplined formation, so effective in open terrain, had become a steel coffin inside the forest road, and Thompson was the undertaker. From Thompson's vantage point, everything moved in slow motion. He saw soldiers yelling, arms waving, confusion turning to panic. German infantry began to scatter into the woods, abandoning vehicles. Some took cover behind trees. Others sprinted into the snow, stumbling and slipping on frozen roots. One officer climbed on top of a tank to get a better view and was cut down by a burst of Thompson's coaxial 50 caliber machine gun. The tracers cut through the fog like angry fireflies. The crew inside the M10 was sweating now, not from fear, but from sheer physical exertion. The loader's hands were blistered, bleeding through his gloves. The assistant gunner's voice was hoarse from yelling coordinates. The tank smelled like grease, hot metal, and cordite, a smell Thompson would never forget. But Ray Thompson was ice, focused. Every shot he took came from calculation. Not adrenaline, not rage, just pure practiced mathematics. Geometry made deadly. He was repositioning after every 2 shells. Not far, 10 yards here, 20 there, but enough to make German gunners doubt their aim. Smoke helped, fog helped, the terrain helped, but the real advantage, they thought there were more of him. The Germans believed they had stumbled into a multi-unit ambush. Some guessed 4 tanks, others said 8. There were even reports of American artillery batteries in the hills. Though no such batteries existed in that sector, the truth, it was one M10 tank destroyer with a 3-man crew and a gunner who was supposed to be following orders. A gunner who had decided that sometimes survival meant breaking every rule in the book. By the 30-minute mark, the road was clogged with burning steel. At least 5 vehicles were destroyed. Another 3 were immobilized. Survivors from the rear, fuel and support crews, had already turned and run back down the forest trail. Abandoning their comrades, the Tiger finally managed to pivot its turret, rotating toward the ridge where Thompson had fired last. Thompson didn't flinch. He waited. He knew the Tiger's armor was thickest in front, but weakest on the sides. And if you knew the exact moment when it turned, when the hull exposed just a sliver of its flank during repositioning, that was your window. That was the moment the fifth shell left the barrel and struck home. A bright hot flash tore through the Tiger's side. For a second it held. Then the internal ammunition cooked off. The entire turret launched upward in a plume of fire, landing several yards away like a discarded toy. The blast was so violent it knocked the German anti-aircraft gun in the rear off balance. Its gunners, stunned, dropped their weapons and ran into the trees. Smoke now poured into the forest like low-lying clouds. The wreckage glowed beneath the gray morning light, and the road that had once been a pipeline of armored strength was now a burning bottleneck of destruction, a monument to what one man could do when the rules no longer made sense. One of Thompson's crewmen looked at him and said, "Are we still going to get court-martialed for this?" Thompson didn't answer. He just loaded another round. The job wasn't finished because you never assumed the enemy was done until you saw them running. And even then you watched, you waited, you stayed ready. Hours later, under interrogation in a makeshift American holding tent, a captured German lieutenant, his face smudged with ash, coat half-burned, eyes glassy with shock, struggled to find the words. He spoke in fits, stammered, paused. "There were many guns," he said in broken English. "Maybe 6, maybe more. We were attacked by a full battery." American intelligence officers exchanged glances. There hadn't been a battery. There hadn't even been a full unit. There was just one M10 Wolverine and a gunner who officially had never been given permission to fire, a gunner who had acted on instinct, training, and a Kansas farm kid's understanding of angles. Other German prisoners described it differently. Some said it was an ambush laid by paratroopers with anti-tank weapons. Others claimed the Americans had planted mines and booby traps. Evidence of sabotage, not gunnery. One man, barely 20, swore he saw muzzle flashes from 3 different angles. But the flash pattern had come from one source. Thompson, who had moved after every shot, who had used the terrain like a magician uses misdirection in their confusion. The Germans had begun to invent enemies that didn't exist. Fear filled in the blanks. Even seasoned tank commanders reported seeing American armor silhouettes deeper in the trees, in the chaos of burning wrecks, smoke, and disintegrating command chains. They imagined what they couldn't identify. It wasn't cowardice, it was psychology. They simply couldn't believe one man had done that. One man with one gun and a notebook full of sketches. To them, it was impossible that a single tank destroyer could have struck with such timing, such precision, and such devastating effect. And in a way, they were right. This hadn't been brute force. This had been surgical disruption. Thompson's decision to fire at specific targets, 3rd, 6th, and 8th vehicles, followed a logic no German unit had prepared for. German doctrine taught that American forces were slow to respond, overly reliant on orders from above. The assumption was that Americans were efficient only in numbers, not improvisation, but Thompson had violated that expectation. He had thought like a German commander, then struck like a ghost. He had used their own doctrine against them. One prisoner described it as if the trees had opened fire. Another claimed to have heard whistling, which might have been a delayed memory of the shells or just the wind in the trees distorted by fear. When American forces moved in to clear the road hours later, what they found stunned even hardened veterans. The wreckage looked like the aftermath of a coordinated airstrike. Vehicles stacked like dominoes, burned-out frames fused together by heat. Frozen corpses sprawled across the snow, some still clutching rifles, trees splintered like toothpicks. Tracks bent sideways, dug deep into the dirt. But above all, what was missing? What made it so strange? Was the absence of American dead. There were none, because there had only ever been one gunner from that day forward. Survivors from that German column would refer to the incident by a single phrase, die Geister-Batterie, the Ghost Battery, and the name would haunt German intelligence reports for months. A phantom unit that didn't exist. A nightmare that was all too real. For 48 hours, Ray Thompson expected to be arrested. After the shooting stopped, after the smoke cleared and the Germans either fled or burned, he sat inside the M10, motionless. His loader offered him a sip from a canteen. He didn't respond. The adrenaline had drained. Now came the dread. They had disobeyed direct orders. They had fired without permission. And regardless of how many tanks were burning, the military had rules. Back at the battalion headquarters, Thompson filed his report. His commanding officer, a captain from Pittsburgh named Langston, read it without saying a word. He flipped through the pages. Thompson's sketches, range estimates, the diagram of the firing sequence. His face a mixture of anger and disbelief. You could see him wrestling with it. The rule book versus the result. You know, Langston finally said, if this had gone wrong, if even one of those was friendly fire, Thompson nodded. He didn't make excuses. I knew what I saw, he said simply. Langston stared at him, then exhaled. No one authorized this, Thompson. You understand that? I do. Langston didn't reprimand him. Not yet. Instead, he said, go get some rest. I've got to send this upstairs. Upstairs meant division command, which meant scrutiny, which often meant punishment, especially for enlisted men who acted outside protocol. Thompson returned to his crew. They were quiet too. No backpatting, no celebration. They were all waiting for the hammer to fall. But it didn't. Not immediately. Because something else happened first. The scouts from the 101st Airborne arrived, and they changed everything. They came through Noville 2 days later, faces hollow, eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights and trench exposure. They had expected to find that forest road crawling with the armor. Instead, they found twisted German wreckage. They asked which unit took this out. Langston said it wasn't a unit. It was one gunner. Word spread faster than orders. At mess tents, in supply lines, across battalion radios. People began talking about the guy from Kansas who took out a Panzer column by himself. Some exaggerated the story, said it was 10 tanks, said he did it with 5 shells, said he used bouncing shots like a trick pool player. But in the middle of the legend forming, the official investigation began, and Thompson waited. Division intelligence reviewed Thompson's field notes. They interviewed the loader, the assistant gunner, even tried to contact higher command to confirm Thompson's radio situation that day. They couldn't prove disobedience because there was no clear record of orders being received. The lines had been jammed. Thompson's crew had tried to report. Nothing came back. What they could confirm, however, was the kill count. 7 vehicles completely destroyed. 4 more disabled, 0 American casualties. 1 strategic objective, Noville's North Road held. 1 airborne unit cut off and under siege reconnected to supply lines. And 1 decision made in silence without clearance had kept that corridor open, had saved lives, had changed the battle. Langston was called in to relay final disposition. He expected a reprimand. What came instead was something more unusual. The division commander said, "Don't put this in the official briefing. Not yet. But tell your gunner, we'll be watching his work." Thompson didn't receive a medal. Not then, but he wasn't court-martialed, in fact. He was quietly assigned to train other gunners on firing pattern theory, how to disable convoys through sequence rather than brute force. No one said the word hero. No one saluted. But he was asked to diagram his decision-making, and his diagrams were sent to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, to the U.S. Army Artillery School. That's when it hit him. They hadn't just forgiven what he did. They were studying it, turning his improvisation into doctrine, his disobedience into training material. Langston approached him one evening, weeks later, while Thompson was cleaning the breech of a recoilless rifle. "You know," Langston said, "I was ready to report you for insubordination." Thompson looked up. Langston shrugged. "But then I read that line in your notebook, the one about controlled collapse. What did you mean by that?" Thompson wiped his hands. "When you pull one stone from a wall, he said. The rest falls if you know where to pull. Langston smiled. Well, next time you decide to knock down a wall, just give me a little warning. Thompson didn't smile back. He just nodded because to him it wasn't a victory. It was a solution, a calculation, a necessity. And deep down, he knew it could have gone the other way. He'd made peace with that. But war doesn't always punish disobedience. Sometimes it learns from it. Sometimes it realizes that the men on the ground see things the generals never will. Ray Thompson never asked to be remembered. He didn't keep journals. He didn't pose for photographs. After the war, he went home to Kansas, married a girl named Helen from the next town over, and started a small repair shop near Dodge City. He fixed tractors, built grain silos, taught his son geometry by marking angles in the dirt with a stick. He never once called himself a hero, but others did, because years after the Battle of the Bulge, the Army quietly began teaching something they called asymmetrical engagement sequencing, a fancy term for a deceptively simple idea. Don't aim for the front, aim for the collapse. The case study they used: a single engagement outside Neville, Belgium. They showed grainy, overhead maps of a forest road, wreckage patterns, vehicle placements, firing trajectories. No names were given. The file was unclassified, but buried in artillery doctrine manuals that most officers never read. Still, the students at Fort Sill and later Fort Benning studied it because it worked, because it saved lives, because it changed the understanding of what one gunner could do, not through firepower, but through geometry, through logic, through a willingness to act when orders fall silent, through the courage to trust yourself when the radio goes dead. Years later, a colonel who had studied Thompson's engagement as a young lieutenant would summarize it like this: he didn't break orders, he operated beyond them. It was the ultimate paradox. A man who disobeyed the chain of command became the model for flexible battlefield thinking. His unofficial firing pattern technique was later integrated into Cold War doctrine, especially in training tank destroyer crews to disable Soviet armored columns in Eastern Europe. The concept: create artificial choke points through selective targeting, then exploit the enemy's own formation discipline against them. It was revolutionary, and it came from a Kansas farm kid who had never attended college, who had learned everything he knew from fixing tractors and watching thunderstorms cross the plains. Decades later, a military historian stumbled across the original field report filed by Captain Langston, buried in a cardboard box of World War II after-action reports. It was stamped with a faded red line. The historian tracked down Thompson, now in his 80s, quiet and slightly deaf, living in a modest home with his wife and a cat named Murphy. He asked Ray about that day in the Ardennes. Ray took a long time to answer, then said, "I remember the trees. I remember how still it was before the first shot, like the world was holding its breath." He didn't speak of victory or glory or regret, just precision, just necessity. When asked why he didn't wait for orders, he replied, "Because by the time the radio worked, it would have been too late." He paused, then added, "I didn't break the rules. I just stepped past them for a minute, long enough to do what had to be done." That answer never made it into the official history books, but it stuck with the historian, and now, maybe with you. Ray Thompson didn't win the war, but he saved a road. He saved a column of paratroopers. He saved a moment. And in war, sometimes that's everything. He reminded the Army that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it calculates, and sometimes it pulls the trigger. Not out of defiance, but out of a deeper duty. One gunner, one decision, one pattern, and an entire German column brought to its knees. And the echoes of those shells still whisper through the frozen trees of the Ardennes. A reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of war aren't the ones that follow orders, but the ones that understand when silence is more dangerous than sound, when waiting means losing, when one man with the courage to act can change the course of history, one shell at a time, one angle at a time, one decision that rewrites the meaning of duty itself.